Everyone, welcome.
44 of the Standing Committee of Environment and Sustainable Development. This is a public meeting. For those in person, please remember to follow the health and safety guidelines for your microphones to prevent audio or feedback incidents for our translators. We are commencing our day's study on single-use plastics prohibition regulations today. And we have two sets of witnesses for the first hour. Here we have Dr. Chelsea Rockman, Assistant Professor of the University of Toronto. We have Scott Thurlow, Senior Advisor, Government Affairs of Dow Canada. And we have Dr. Peter Ross, Senior Scientist of Raincoast Conservation Foundation. Each witness will have 5 minutes to present some opening statements. I do have a little timed sign to warn you when you're at a minute, and when you're out of time, please wrap up. We'll use that throughout the session. And we will begin with Dr. Rockman. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Miedema and Vice Chairs Ross and Bonin, for the invitation. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share my expertise. My name is Chelsea Rockman, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Toronto. I have been researching plastic pollution for nearly 20 years. My research is widely known for increasing our understanding of the prevalence, the persistence, and ecological effects of plastics in the environment. I study plastic debris globally, including here in the Great Lakes, as well as in the Canadian Arctic. I'm often asked to advise governments on the issue of plastics in the environment. This includes the United Nations and every level of government in both the United States and here in Canada. I recently co-led a working group on monitoring and risk for the International Joint Commission, a binational organization created by Canada and the U.S. to protect our resources and boundary waters, including in the Great Lakes. Today, I will focus on the evidence demonstrating that plastic pollution is ubiquitous, persistent, and harmful. Plastic pollution is increasing, and if we want to protect wildlife, we must focus on waste reduction, which is a proven solution. According to the Government of Canada, we lost 90,000 tons of plastics to the environment in 2019, which is equivalent to 53 million garbage bags of plastic waste, a figure predicted to increase 19% by 2040. In Toronto, I can tell you a bit about what I see. I supervise students who clean and monitor plastic floating in our harbor. They cover about a 2-kilometer stretch of the waterfront. Every year, we remove hundreds of thousands of pieces of plastic from the water, and the most common items we see are single-use plastics, including food wrappers, straws, plastic bags, bottle caps, and cigarette filters. Although we clean a lot, we don't make a dent. Cleanup will not solve this problem, and we are currently failing to keep Toronto's waters clean. Toronto's Don River is among the most urbanized in Canada. We estimate this river contributes roughly tens of thousands of plastic items plus 500 billion microplastics, defined as 1 micron to 5 millimeters in size, into Lake Ontario annually. And downstream, the fish have the highest levels of microplastics reported globally. Microplastics are in every fish that we sample from Lake Ontario as part of the government's sport fish program. That's every fish. The weight of evidence about the effects of microplastic has grown quite a bit. There is no doubt that microplastics can harm organisms. Scientists now have enough data to synthesize toxicity results into risk assessments. Most recently, within the International Joint Commission, we quantified the risk of microplastics to the Great Lakes. Based on our findings, our group of scientists and policymakers recommended that microplastics be listed as a chemical of mutual concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Across the lakes, there is a consistent release of plastic. It is ubiquitous, it's persistent, and it is found at concentrations that cross risk thresholds. Related to this, plastic manufactured items fit the definition of toxic under CEPA, which states that a substance is toxic if it enters the environment in a concentration or under conditions that may have a harmful effect. Plastic manufactured items break down into microplastics in the environment, but moreover, whole plastic manufactured items cause harm at amounts we see in nature. Animals eat plastic items such as bottle caps, straws, and bags, and this can cause injury or death. We recently published a quantitative risk assessment in a top scientific journal measuring how much plastic is too much for seabirds, turtles, and marine mammals. Plastic ingestion has been documented in every seabird family, every marine mammal family, and every sea turtle species. Based on necropsy data, our model predicts the amount of plastic that is nearly certain to kill an animal. For seabirds, plastic waste in the volume of 1 to 2 marbles will almost certainly be lethal. For turtles, the number is about 1 to 2 baseballs, and for whales, 1 to 7 basketballs. If you are a smaller animal, death can occur from a smaller load. Just 1 bottle cap can kill a seabird. There is risk to wildlife from the amounts we observe in nature, and thus the current state of the science supports managing plastic under SEPA. Since Canada started to address plastic pollution seriously, we have quickly risen as a global leader due to Canada's comprehensive policies aimed at reducing plastic waste and pollution, which includes the ban on a handful of single-use plastic items and microbeads and rinse-off personal care products. Since the ban on microbeads, their presence has plummeted in Great Lakes water samples. Since the single-use plastic ban, the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup reports a decline in every single one of these items. Reducing single-use plastic that are common in the environment, are not practically reusable or recyclable, and that have a substitution is a key part of the transition to a circular economy. It also protects the environment. The scientific evidence supports staying the course, continuing to be a leader, and enforcing the current policies already in place. Thank you. Be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rockman. We will now turn to Mr. Thurlow for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It is my pleasure to be here today to speak on the issue of plastic and plastic waste. The Dow Chemical Company was founded by Herbert H. Dow, a Canadian-born industry pioneer, native of Mr. Millet's riding, born in Belleville, Ontario. Today, Dow is one of the world's leading material science companies, serving customers in high-growth markets such as packaging, infrastructure, mobility, and consumer applications. We operate manufacturing sites in 29 countries and employ over 30,000 people around the world. Dow Canada is headquartered in Calgary and has manufacturing facilities in Alberta and Ontario. As you may have heard, in 2021, Dow announced the expansion of our Fort Saskatchewan facility. That expansion will triple the production of our polyethylene and derivatives. In so doing, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we will be net zero from a Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions perspective. That expansion is generously supported by the federal, provincial, and municipal governments and is already creating thousands of construction jobs. Dow has been at the forefront of Canada's approach to plastic and plastic waste since the very beginning. As we have articulated before many other parliamentary committees, the approach that the federal government has used to date has been to use the wrong act to solve the wrong problem, doing it the wrong way. Plastic is not toxic, and we verily believe that the use of the toxic substances provisions of SEPA is inappropriate. We have never wavered from that position. The best way to ensure plastic remains in the economy is to incentivize greater recycling rates for materials after use. We believe that government policy can create demand for products with recycled content, and we remain committed to a recycled content standard for all plastic packaging. We strongly believe that creating a market for post-consumer plastic is the best way to ensure that it is returned to the economy and not permanently orphaned in a landfill or escape into the environment. No one is going to argue that fugitive plastic waste entering the environment isn't a problem, but to think of post-consumer use plastic as waste is a missed opportunity. Through chemical conversion, industry can depolymerize post-consumer plastics and return those molecules to the economy. Transitioning to a circular economy is not only vital to the preservation and protection of our planet's natural resources, but it's also critical to the business successes of Dow. As we transform to a circular economy, we are taking into account a product's life cycle, from creation to use to disposal, in everything we do and create. We are taking a leading role in driving a more circular economy by designing for circularity and building new business models for circular materials. Dow believes that public policy will be a critical enabler of successfully establishing a circular economy. Smart policies, as well as partnerships, can help drive innovation and accelerate the adoption and expansion of advanced recycling to complement traditional recycling. Policy should be promoting advanced and chemical recycling alongside other recycling technologies. This is essential to resolving the issue of hard-to-recycle substances in products. No policy should deselect approaches that can best prevent plastic from being recovered and placed back into the economy. We believe we need to invest in the waste management infrastructure to improve the supply chain and enable advanced recycling technology approaches. We believe that this should begin with a more favorable tax status for industry investments in all stages of the materials ecosystem. We have recommended that private actions that support the expansion of the waste infrastructure be supported by favorable tax treatment like an accelerated capital cost allowance so that the work of the private sector can be encouraged to be incorporated into the work that provinces and municipalities do every day. Every dollar that industry spends throughout the materials ecosystem is a dollar that the government does not have to spend dealing with post-consumer plastic. In conclusion, the government should be looking at waste infrastructure the same way that they are looking at our trade infrastructure and our transportation infrastructure. It's critical for the economy to succeed and grow. I would welcome the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thurlow. We will now turn to Dr. Ross for 5 minutes. Over to you.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you for inviting me today. I've been studying plastic and microplastic pollution for the past 20 years in Canada, during which time I worked as a federal scientist at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, at the Vancouver Aquarium, Oceanwise, and now at Raincoast Conservation Foundation. I'm a toxicologist, which means I'm concerned about the impacts of chemicals and pollutants on the well-being of Canadians and Canadian wildlife. For 4 decades, I've studied a variety of pollutants in killer whales, beluga whales, harbor seals, salmon, shellfish, and in air, water, and sediments. I've worked with First Nations across Canada to look at the safety of Indigenous foods. Most of what I've studied have been chemical in nature: PCBs, dioxins, PBDEs, pesticides, hydrocarbons, metals, including mercury, among others. So plastics have emerged as kind of a unique pollutant in my world, a structural pollutant, a pollutant of obviously widespread scientific, public and policy concern, a pollutant where every piece or particle is nearly unique in shape, size, and formulation. Think, as Canadians might, of a snowflake, where we've got an infinite number of structures. This complexity in this pollutant class renders the technical characterization of plastics and microplastics challenging, but also offers incredible opportunities for scientific research, advances, information exchange, and innovation. I'd like to summarize a few points below that reflect my professional perspective on the topic of plastics and microplastics. Firstly, as has been shared today, plastics and microplastics have been widely detected throughout Canada's 3 oceans as well as in freshwater and terrestrial environments. Plastics and microplastics kill fish and wildlife. They are toxic. They can cause entanglement of whales, turtles, seabirds, seals. They can suffocate. They can starve through artificial satiation. Plastics and microplastics are pervasive and persistent pollutants. They do not break down chemically during our lifetimes, but they break up into smaller and smaller pieces, such that every piece of large plastic is a reservoir of future microplastics. They can be found in the air we breathe today from this polyester carpet, the water we drink, and the food we eat. The plastic pollution problem is only getting worse each and every day. Global plastic production is doubling every 10 to 15 years. Shoreline or ocean cleanups are useful for data and education, but are an ineffective band-aid for the growing plastic pollution problem. Recycling systems, despite the best intentions of municipalities, provincial agencies, fail to collect the vast majority of plastic waste in Canada. Additives, colors, and chemical formulations, including endocrine-disrupting compounds, prevent a safe and circular plastics economy. The majority of plastics in our blue bins end up either in landfills or in dead-end products, such as park benches, carpets, or curtains. This means that recycling entails, generally speaking, a maximum of 2 uses for virgin plastic. Remember the stubby? 44 uses for the beer bottle that we used to use in Canada. Third major point this morning, plastic pollution comes from all of us. We are all polluters. But fishing and aquaculture sector remains an important source of plastics in the ocean, representing probably half the floating plastics in the Pacific right now. Millions of fibers from clothes. Much of this polyester are shed with each laundry. And this is something we've detected in seawater throughout the Arctic Ocean, with even 47 microfibers under the water at the North Pole. These are coming from textiles and laundry. Municipal wastewater treatment reduces but does not eliminate discharge into our waterways with the microplastics retained in biosolids now being spread on our farmers' fields. They're not destroyed by wastewater treatment. Single-use packaging from restaurant customers, recreational users, and travelers can be found on our streets and shorelines. This is something that every child can tell us about and that we all do our best to avoid. Plastic packaging accounts for approximately 47% of plastic waste in Canada. This is ending up largely in landfills. That's 1.4 million tons per year. More than 86% of plastic waste ends up in landfills. And during my 25 years of working on plastic, these numbers have not changed substantially, barring a few low-hanging fruit items that my esteemed colleague, Dr. Rockman, spoke to. I believe, as Dr. Rockman presented, that Canada is well positioned for further global leadership. My time is up. I will wrap up. My apologies, Madam Chair. Canada's supper regulations have directly led to less plastic litter. Canada's addition of plastic manufactured items to the domestic substances list allows Ottawa to identify further products. I think Canada can further strengthen its leadership through the following: innovation and research in material sciences, textile designs, and wastewater treatment, facilitating national knowledge exchange through working groups, conferences, consultations, strengthening research capacities through interlaboratory calibration and other exercises, encourage home source controls through updated appliance standards, consumer education, and so forth, strengthening the market value, as my esteemed colleague to my left had emphasized, and the food safety of recycled plastics through the labeling of plastic formulations for additives and dyes, and continuing to build a national recycling framework through the leadership of the CCME to encourage municipalities and provinces to get on board in a national way that would improve the marketability and the circular economy. And finally, Madam Chairman, to consider the value of braided Western science and the importance and the important contribution of Indigenous knowledge. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. We will now go to questions by committee members, and we will begin with Mr. Leslie for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Thurlow, the government still has not explained the basic contradiction here. I'm wondering if you can. If a product is considered toxic enough to ban for use for everyday Canadians, why is it acceptable to manufacture it in Canada and send it across the border?
I'm afraid you're going to have to ask the minister that question because I can't answer it.
So we're heading into, as long as we don't screw it up before we start, renegotiations on CUSMA. Has the United States ever raised Canada's plastics policy broadly, or including this specific toxic designation or export rules as a trade irritant?
So every year, the USTR trade representative puts out a report about the global trade irritants around the world. In their most recent report, they very specifically pointed to Canada's plastic waste agenda as something that was a trade irritant. And you may or may not know that the current CUSMA has a chapter that's dedicated to plastic management and plastic waste. So it's certainly something the United States has mentioned. They've gone so far to say that the proposed reductions to food packaging and packaging compostability requirements could compromise food safety, increase food loss and waste, and restrict U.S. agricultural exports. So yes, they have identified this as a trade irritant.
Thank you. Now, in your opening remarks, I think echoed by all the witnesses, this is about what do we do once the plastic is here. So instead of relying on a blanket toxic designation and bans, what in your assessment would be more practical way to reduce plastic waste without punishing the actual manufacturers in Canada?
So industry has long argued in favor of a recycled content mandate, and a recycled content mandate is the requirement that a certain percentage of the plastic come from non-virgin resources. So doing will create a market for that product. It will allow for industry to make targeted investments based on the existence of the rule. They could go to their financiers and say, we now have a rule that says that we have to do this. Please give us the funding on favorable terms so that we can build the infrastructure that we need to do that. That is precisely how the Canadian Renewable Fuels Network was created under Prime Minister Harper's government. There was an amendment to SEPA that very specifically spoke to the composition of the fuels. Investments happened as a direct result of those fuels, and it was a legislative amendment and then a subsequent regulatory requirement that allowed for that renewable fuels industry to grow. We would tell you that the same growth would happen in the recycling industry.
So you mentioned, so I mean, we were looking at the stick approach here. That is, I think, part of the carrot. You also mentioned tax treatment. Could you identify specifically what the carrots would be for industry that would the government should consider to help reduce plastic waste and improve the overall recycling system?
Certainly. So we've long argued for tax incentives to help facilitate investments in what we describe as the materials ecosystem. And we're not fussy about it. We just want to make sure that there is credit that is provided for things that are investments to the manufacturing process to encourage a design for circularity. We are interested in tax credits for consumer and business education about how the product gets back into this circular economy. Collecting, cleaning, sorting, mechanical recycling, the creation of the facilities for chemical recycling, and then, any development of more sustainable feedstocks as well. All of these things are part and parcel of part of the solution that can help reduce the amount of resin that gets back into the waste cycle.
You mentioned the need for a recycling content plan of some sort for plastic packaging. What model, either that's already being tried, tested internationally, but more specifically made in Canada, what model would work in Canada in your assessment?
So again, I would tell you that something that has the force of law at the federal level that would encourage investments based on the issue of concern, which is collection, distribution, repurposing, all of those things in that same life cycle. Something that has a rule, that has the force of law, and then there is a corresponding financial incentive to make those investments.
So obviously the benefit of that is keeping plastics out of the environment, but what would the spin-off economic benefits possibly be? I assume a supply chain would need to be developed and better handle all of this excess waste being diverted correctly into a recycled system.
So right now we have multiple different supply chains, and I will say that British Columbia does it the best. British Columbia has somewhat of a unified system where the rules are the same in all the municipalities. But I think once you get away from individual municipalities deploying their relatively meager resources at different problems, and you have kind of a galvanized effect of everyone rowing in the same direction to create a similar type of infrastructure, you will absolutely see spin-off benefits from that. I mean, the better the system is at reclaiming and repurposing these materials, the less virgin materials have to come out of the ground. Like, that has a different economic impact, but there's also a value that's added through each stage of that process.
So just to clearly juxtapose, the ban, it doesn't seem to be working versus an opportunity for a domestic market of enhanced players within the game here that could both achieve environmental goals while also enhancing the ability to reuse these existing products. Is that correct, or can you sum it up better than that?
I couldn't agree more. I think that a comprehensive product ban has not been demonstrated to solve the problem. We would much rather have something that is a much more comprehensive approach and isn't, pardon the pun, whacking a mole one at a time.
Mr. Leslie, we will now turn to Mr. Greaves online for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. My first question is for Dr. Ross. Thank you for joining us today, sir. And in particular, thank you for your contributions to the study of our ecosystems and water systems in southern British Columbia, in particular, highly relevant experience that informs our discussion and our study today. I'd like to drill into this question of the economic impacts of plastics. As we were just hearing, we're often presented with the argument about the negative environmental impacts of regulating plastics in various ways. But from a differing perspective, and as a representative of a coastal community that has millions of visitors come every single year, we see the way in which plastic pollutions on our coastline and in our waters is actually an economic threat to one of our core industries, waterways in the visitor economy. And I would suggest that that's true not just on Vancouver Island, but everywhere that we have beautiful coastlines in this country, whether that's elsewhere on the BC coast, whether that's in Grossmoor National Park in Newfoundland, whether that's the Bow River in Alberta, or indeed on the shores of Lake Ontario. So in that context, Dr. Ross, I'm wondering if you could speak to the volume of plastic pollution that we have in our waterways and any comments you could offer about the economic harms that plastic pollution causes to our local and regional economies.
Thank you, through the chair, to Mr. Reeves. That's a great question. I mean, whenever we look at a pollutant, we look at the potential for harm to fish, wildlife, and human health. And in coastal British Columbia, where our Indigenous communities are relying on aquatic foods, consuming on average 15 times as much seafood as the average Canadian, we remain concerned that the microplastics and plastics that are either killing fish and wildlife or getting eaten by fish and wildlife that are then consumed by First Nations represent a significant setback to our attempts at reconciliation. So assuring food safety for Indigenous communities, I think, is a preeminent interest of ours. To the point about the effectiveness of supper in this context, I do note that the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup has documented significant declines in the number of plastic bags and straws on Canadian shorelines, to the tune of 60% straw reduction and 25% less bags. So these are large amounts of plastic. But again, the single-use plastic regulations only target 3% of the total plastic waste entering Canadian waterways, so that we suffer from continued blights on our shorelines that are a problem for tourism. And in BC and on the East Coast, we have whales that are entangled in fishing gear, most of this being plastic. So there are significant impediments to the health and well-being of wildlife, at-risk species such as the southern resident killer whales that are endangered and number only 74 individuals, and food safety for all Canadians. So tourism, food safety, Indigenous food security, these all have significant threats to their well-being, and obviously have bearing on economic well-being for those communities, or the communities relying upon them.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Ross. You anticipated my next question, so I'd like to just drill in on the connection between land, rivers, the seas and oceans that surround us, and marine life. As you're aware, for our community here in Victoria, our urban and rural watersheds are directly tied to the health of the Salish Sea, and as you mentioned, the southern resident orcas, as well as salmon populations which inhabit those waters, are really inseparable from our way of life and many aspects of culture and identity on the BC coast. In that context, could you please explain how plastic pollution from inland watersheds is compounding the challenges facing these species in critical marine habitats, and specifically what targeted interventions at the watershed level would yield the greatest benefit for cleaner oceans and waters for all of us?
Through the chair, thank you very much for that. Dr. Rochman will be able to complement my any response that I might offer, but I will say that in general terms, we feel as though 80% of ocean pollution come from land-based activities. And there's no question that plastics and microplastics are entering waterways throughout our terrestrial environments and paddling to the sea. They're heading down to sea, where we suffer the consequences. In terms of sources of microplastics in particular, we're very concerned about wastewater treatment plants that discharge liquid effluent that contains microplastics. In Vancouver, we have 5 major wastewater treatment plants. One of those, the largest one, releases an estimated 30 billion particles of plastic every single year, and that represents less than 5% of the microplastics that enter the plant. That means that 95% of the microplastics, much from our clothing, we lose 10 million fibers every time we wash a single load of laundry, and that enters the wastewater stream. So 95% of those fibers are retained as solid waste and redistributed under federal policy, under CCME policy, and under provincial legislation as biosolids. They're spread onto farmlands and for mining reclamation and in silviculture. Those plastics are not degraded. So we now have microplastics throughout our farms, and they will ultimately drain slowly but steadily into our waterways where they can affect spawning salmon and other wildlife downstream. So big sources on land absolutely associated with our activities as humans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bonin pour 6 minutes.
Now, Mr. Bonin, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Thurlow, how many employees do you have in Canada?
1,200.
Sorry, 1,200 Dow employees, and then there are several thousand people who are on site building the new facility.
OK. Et combien d'employés au Canada travaillent?
And how many employees in Canada work directly with plastic production?
The committee with an answer on that, but I would assume that it's the overwhelming majority of them.
OK. Fait que, oui, si vous pouvez nous revenir, ça serait apprécié.
So if you could come back to us with that, it would be appreciated. What's the percentage of plastic that you're producing that's coming from fossil fuels?
So in Canada right now, it is almost 100%,
Okay.
because we're in the process of
D'accord.
transitioning.
Et ce sont quoi les...
And what are the greenhouse gases related to the production of the oil and
Very different.
Aujourd'hui, les émissions sont très différentes que ce sera en 2030, ça sera zéro.
pétrole et le
So
gaz?
again, I don't have that number off the
Okay.
top of my head, but it
But-
is available in the National
Super.
Pollutant
Vous
Release
nous, vous nous
Inventory. Yeah.
reviendrez là-dessus, merci. Vous parlez de...
You'll come back to us about that. So you're talking about chemical recycling and you want funds for that. Could you give us information about the process that you're talking about? Who are the buyers? What are the emissions and the pollutants? Could you please give us that information?
Okay,
And
ben, super, on va
I'm
le prendre.
happy to do my very best to give the
Okay.
committee
Ben ouais, on aimerait
useful
ça.
information on
Ce serait
that.
apprécié d'avoir des chiffres là-dessus, merci.
We'd appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Ross, you've been talking about recycling. Are we still at only 9% of plastic that's recycled in Canada? Yes, almost 9%, barely 9% of plastic. And because Canada is part of the coalition of high ambitions in the World Treaty for Plastics, that coalition, of which Canada's a member, speaks of the importance of reducing production. Do you share the opinion that it's important to decrease pollution? It's not through recycling only. No, the recycling is not working very well in Canada. I think we all agree on that. It's barely 9%. So the figure hasn't changed over 20 years. We have small successes here and there, but recycling does not work very well. And that's in part caused by the fact that virgin plastic is cheaper than plastic that's been recycled. So that's a challenge. Secondly, if we want food-safe packaging, sellers prefer plastic that's secure. If a recycled product appears, they don't know if there are chemical products within that. That's a second challenge. And so what do we do? I would say that a cap on plastic production, to my mind, is the only way of avoiding continuous production of pollution in our coastal waters. But I agree entirely with my colleague on my left that an improved system for recycling is absolutely important in Canada. It's not all, but it's important. So you're talking about a cap, but what I see in the coalition of great ambition is a reduction of production, because otherwise we're talking about doubling production over 20 years. Do you agree that we have to decrease production at the source and also promote reuse before even talking about recycling? Plastic is two things. First of all, it's useful, and secondly, it's a pollutant. So we have to support the value of plastic that we have in our economy, so improve the value of that plastic. So with products that are recycled, you have to have labeling that allows us to know what the ingredients are. the components are. I don't want to see tens of thousands of formulas where we don't have the possibility of knowing if it's safe for bottles or hot dog wrappers, etc. So the first thing to do is to have a ban on single-use plastics. Yes, that is a goal that's quite ambitious or aggressive. But if 47% of plastic pollution comes from these wrappers, it's something that we should target. But I'll say, in addition, that these days there's so much innovation in Canada, and we don't have any representatives here who are giving evidence on the value of the alternatives. There are all kinds of them. All kinds of alternative materials can be used. They contribute to the Canadian economy and to environmental protection. Could you provide the committee with documentation on these alternatives? Yes, there are thousands of examples. So would be suspending the ban on exporting of plastic, does that delay Canada in the fight against pollution? Sorry, if we suspend the ban on exporting plastic, as Canada has done, is that a delay in the fight against pollution? Oceans are global. There are no borders. It takes 8 days for contaminants to come from Asia through clouds into our coastal waters in Vancouver. 8 days. So that includes plastic fibers in the air. And for the ocean currents, it takes 1 year for pollutants to reach our shores in Vancouver from Asia. So if we're exporting the problem, we'll find them again in our coastal water. In the Arctic, it was estimated that most of polyester microparticles come from the Atlantic in the north and from North America. They are contaminating our Arctic waters.
Mr. Bexty for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and colleagues and witnesses, for being here today. I really appreciate your time and hope we can benefit from your wisdom. I have so many questions. Dr. Ross, could you please let the committee know what portion of marine plastics come from Canada globally, or what, conversely, what comes from the rest of the world?
That's a great question and an important question. We want to know our place in the world because we want our actions, our behaviors, and our regulations to deal with sources in Canada. Canada is a small player on the in the global economy. And if we look at macroplastics, i.e. think beverage bottles, single-use.
My time is limited, so if you could be succinct. Please.
So most of the macroplastic litter, it's agreed, is found in Southeast Asia, where there are virtually no recycling system and no safe water to drink. So you want to drink bottled water that you can be assured is safe. In Canada, we have been tightening up our rules on, we have blue bins that are very effective at preventing the loss into the environment.
Thank you. I just wanted to get at the number that hits the water, right, and where it comes from globally. Mr. Thurlow. What message do you think it sends to industry and people, right, when products can be manufactured in Canada? And I know you kind of addressed this question, or didn't address it earlier, can be exported from Canada but not sold to Canadians. And what I want to get at ultimately is the unintended consequences of some of our actions, right? We all agree that we don't want pollution, but I don't know that we're going about it the right way. You illustrate some important things about a circular economy that I'll get into later, but what about the hypocrisy of the actions that we've taken so far, that Canada is?
I'm not sure I would use the word hypocrisy. I think I would refer the committee to the Canada Gazette, where the very document that was tabled by Minister de Bruzen illustrated whether or not there was going to be a cost-benefit analysis to the decision to have the rule in place or not. And I think that language speaks for itself.
Okay, thank you. 8 days from Asia, 1 year by water from Asia, it kind of illustrates a lot that what we do here and impacting what we do, impacting Canadians with unintended consequences is not necessarily the first order course of action that will give the biggest benefit. Canadians are being told daily, right, that they should pay more for groceries, that it should accept fewer choices. Food waste is going to become a problem. Affordability is a problem. Everything about, we say quite clearly, plastics are useful. This is why we have plastics. But prohibiting their use won't reduce global plastic pollution significantly from the Canadian perspective in the near term. What other behaviors should be recommended, right, to go to the circular economy that you were talking about, Mr. Thull?
So again, the very first thing I would recommend is some kind of a recycled content mandate for plastic. Environment Canada has begun that type of a consultation. They haven't designed an instrument for public dissemination yet. I would also just remind the committee that when you're walking down the street, there are certain types of plastics that you don't see. Okay, you mentioned the stubby. Well, you don't see plastic liquor bottles. Why? Deposit return. You don't see certain types of cans because of deposit return. So again, like, you have to look at what is working and emulate that model to as many of the other things that would be entering the natural environment as possible.
I think we have to be careful as well, right, about, and I'd like your views on this, about, subsequent unintended consequences because of the few options that are available. I mean, it's been mentioned quite often, a lot of the ocean-borne microplastics are from our clothes. We don't have enough natural fiber in the world to clothe the people that are in the world, right? So what options do we have?
So it's a fair point. We also have a growing world population which needs food. I think without the use of plastic packaging, I think you'd see a drastic increase in food waste. We already have very poor numbers on food waste. I think those numbers are going to go up incredibly without the advent of more use in plastic packaging. And this is particularly acute in rural and remote areas where they don't have the same access to the infrastructure that you see in the big cities.
I can't help but think the experience of going for a milkshake now, and I used to have one plastic straw, but now I have to use 4, right? And it just doesn't square the circle. And I think my time is up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steve. We'll now turn to Mr. Fanjoy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, witnesses. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Rockman. First of all, I've heard from a number of people the great work that's happening at the University of Toronto on sustainability, and just I'm sure that you're part of that. I wanted to ask you, in your decades, I believe you mentioned, of studying plastic pollution, have you uncovered any evidence that the plastics industry is capable of solving this problem on their own?
I think that's a great question. I would say, have I uncovered evidence of plastic industry solving it? Well, we still have the problem, so I'm not sure that it's been solved yet. But I think one of the issues is that the supply chain is diverse. And so it's not just the people who make the pellets. They have to work with the people who mold it into a product. That product has to be made in such a way that it's practically recyclable, meaning if something is marketed to be colorful and beautiful, it doesn't recycle very well. Then you have to have that waste management infrastructure. Fully agree, we need to increase that. Then it needs to be recycled. Our most valuable plastic right now, or maybe not most valuable, but what we consider the most recoverable, is PET water bottles. Right now in Canada, we recycle 20% of PET. Why? Right now it's not working. So we do need a better full system, and single-use plastic bans seem to be at least reducing what we see in the environment, which is protecting wildlife. And what we've banned so far isn't packaging. It's other items.
We have a bit of a throwaway culture, and it's we're going to have to deal with that. There is no away with plastic. It all goes somewhere. I have a community in my riding of Carleton that possibly could be the site of a future landfill. And they're very concerned about that. So whether that's that garbage goes to our ridings or someplace in Canada, or it migrates around the world, someone is paying a price for that, and also someone is profiting from that. So how do we how do we balance the desire to have the benefits of that plastics have delivered? And I don't argue that there are some benefits, but how do we mitigate the toxic mass that they're creating to our environment?
I mean, I think there's a lot of great uses of plastic material, from putting it in cars and airplanes to medical equipment. But just about 50%, 40% of all the plastics that we create are single-use plastics. Some, you may argue, are necessary and some are less necessary. And so the policy that was put in place here is, if it is less necessary, it's replaceable, it's often found in the environment, that's the one you can reduce. Human behavior change is really hard, but it's a big part of the equation. But when we interview people on the streets and say, restaurants and people thinking about reusable foodware, what is your willingness to change? People are willing to change. They want those solutions in place. So yes, we can reduce and protect the environment, but still use the plastics that I think are really important. I think we need both.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Ross, in your research, what is the status of substitutes for single-use plastics that can meet our needs but be less harmful or even beneficial to the environment?
That's a great question. My research has been really focused on pollution, which is, what do I find in our waterways? What do I find in our wildlife? What do we find in our indigenous foods? And those include many harmful chemicals that Canada has since banned. Look at the leadership role that Canada played in developing the Stockholm Convention to eliminate persistent organic pollutants. That was science-based, it was concerned about the Inuit, and it took action, and now the world has rallied around that treaty, and it's very effective in improving the health and safety of our indigenous foods and our wildlife. In terms of innovation, I mean, in Vancouver, there are lots of products. You can go into a coffee shop and use their cup. You can use a paper cup. Sometimes they're lined with plastic. We've got to be careful. There are bamboo plates. There are coconut products. There are all sorts of things going on. And I put it to you that there's lots of innovation, and there is a Canadian economy around alternative materials. And I would encourage the committee not just to think about the plastics as a material, but also the alternatives to those plastics. There's money in it.
Enjoy. Maintenant, Monsieur Bonin pour 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Bonin, you have 2 minutes. I'll give my last minute to my Green Party candidate here, my colleague, rather. You talking about greenhouse gases. Could you tell us about over the whole cycle of life, the GHG emissions, Mr. Thurlow? I wanted to be more specific.
Je vous enverrai ça, mais c'est très gentil. Madame Rockman.
And Ms. Rockman, I saw that you have many recommendations on how we could go further to counter plastic pollution through regulation. Could you send this to the committee, because you don't have time? You had a series of recommendations, and Mr. Ross as well, you had some to really improve the Canadian strategy, what you see that we could do. And so, and do you find that it's contradictory that the government talks about protecting nature and is going back in terms of the fight against plastic pollution? Do you find that that's consistent?
I'm really sorry.
Oh.
Yeah. Did you say that the government really wants to protect nature and you're worried that we're going backwards on it? Was that the question?
Pollution.
On plastic pollution. Yes, I mean, I think Canada was a really large leader in this space when we started taking it seriously around 2019. I mean, you could say 2017 with the microbead ban. And we were moving forward on so many things, including recycled content standards. And we are at risk of going backwards. And I don't think right now we have a reason to do it. We haven't solved the problem. I mean, the amount of plastic I see in Lake Ontario just walking the shoreline is astounding. Yeah.
I will let my colleague.
Madam Chair, a minute. Dr. Ross, I'm wondering, obviously, we've got involved, a lot of us, in trying to get rid of single-use plastics because we saw it choking the life out of wildlife. But I'm really quite concerned about microplastics entering the human body, the health effects of that. And you mentioned landfills. So if you could touch briefly on microplastics and human health and what you're finding in landfills, for instance, any sign of the forever chemicals, the PFAS.
Great series of questions. We are concerned about microplastics in human health, particularly nanoplastics that can freely pass the GI tract barrier and even the blood-brain barrier. So we are concerned about very, very small particles of plastic. And remember my comment, or if I can recall my comment about all plastics today will not break down chemically in the future. They will break down into smaller and smaller pieces such that all plastics are a reservoir for potential human health risks. So think about a plastic bottle today. In 1,000 years, it might be 1 million pieces of plastic. So we're very worried about that. Sorry, I think my time is up, but you had a second question?
PFAS, if it was in
PFAS. We are detecting per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are forever chemicals. There are 15,000 of them. We only have the analytical methods to measure 44 of them. Very complex family. They're found, it's the old Teflon Scotchgard family of chemicals. The shorter change versions are found in airport aqueous firefighting foams and other products, some stain repellents, water repellents. They're forever chemicals. Like plastics, they are found in landfills. They're leaching out of landfills. They're contaminating groundwater supplies. I find them in drinking water supplies in British Columbia.
We will now turn to Mr. Ross for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this on? Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for your testimony to all the witnesses. And I am Indigenous. I come from Kitimat Village, BC. And I appreciate the comments saying that you'll look for Indigenous knowledge. But to be clear, Indigenous people use plastics just as much as non-Indigenous. It's an affordability issue. It's a safety issue when we're talking about food packaging. So we've been struggling for answers to the same questions that you're posing today in terms of the marine environment, for example, for rivers and oceans. And I do eat seafood 4 times a week still. But in saying that, in talking about affordability and the safety of food packaging that plastic provides, and this is for Mr. Roachman, should the federal government ban single-use plastics used in food packaging and in grocery stores?
I don't have a good answer to that. I don't necessarily think we know enough to do that. I think for certain packaging, I think the answer is it depends. For certain food items where a box is just as good at keeping the product viable for a long time.
How about meat?
Meat, I think it would be very hard to get away from plastic and meat unless we're going to a butcher regularly and we're getting it wrapped in the paper and we're having it handed to us.
Okay. Has the government, the federal government, indicated any openness to a ban of single-use plastics in grocery stores?
I haven't seen any. So we actually had a project in grocery stores for a bit. We were more focused on the produce bags that you can choose to take or not to choose, or not to take. No, there is a pollution prevention plan for grocery stores. I think it's been unpopular, but there has been a pollution prevention plan for grocery stores to try to get them to reduce their plastics where they can.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Mr. Ross, I was intrigued by your comments about the content and how it's ending up in our environment. And to my understanding, what you said is we're all polluters, including every one of us that wears suits. Each one of us have synthetic fibers that's making it into our environment every time we wash our clothes. I've never heard that before. But Canada's trying, at least. They're trying. And I'll give you the example of synthetic fibers and tires. So BC is trying to regulate this, and they're doing a pretty good job. But 15% of every tire makes it into our environment. But it's regulated so we know exactly what's in a tire, so we know exactly what's getting into the environment. Unfortunately, that does not speak to other countries that use loopholes to get commercial tires into our market in BC. And so we don't know what's in those tires coming from China, for example. And so as an option, what BC is considering is saying, hiring the fees for British Columbians who obey the rules to cover the costs of these single-use tires coming in from China. Is there anything that Canada can do to help persuade the provinces and other countries not to import or export from their countries into our countries their products that don't abide by our environmental regulations.
Absolutely. I believe very strongly in the power of trade agreements, and I believe in the power of CEPA and other pieces of relevant legislation and other treaties globally that prevent pollutants or harmful substances getting into the Canadian economy. For example, we are not allowed to import PCBs into Canada or manufacture them or dispose of them.
So how do the government square this when then Canadians want to do good by the environment? They are recycling their tires. They are bringing it to approved facilities. But yet there's a huge amount of tires coming from China, single use, that can't be recycled. And we don't know what's in those tires. And so basically, somehow it's not even being recycled. It's ending up in our landfills. And Canadians have to foot the bill for this. I think this is important right now because the federal government is now talking about a new trade agreement with China, and yet they haven't resolved the environmental impact of these single-use tires ending up in our Canadian environment.
I think that's a great example. In fact, a lot of tires are not only ending up in landfills, they're ending up being recycled to put onto our children's playing fields, where they have harmful chemicals, a lot of them proprietary. I would go back to my point about labeling. There are something like 600 chemicals in tires for which there's no
in terms of China,
information.
in terms of a single-use product coming from China that's a tire that can't be recycled, we don't know what the content, and everybody's turning a blind eye to it. How do we address that as Canadians, and how do we get the federal government and the provincial governments to actually take it seriously?
We require labeling on that imported product, so the proprietary components of that tire are made known to the authorities in Environment Canada.
And those products...
Sorry.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Mr. Grant for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'll start with you, Mr. Thurlow, and it's been clear that the plastics manufacturers are not in agreement with the government trying to ban their products. This is quite clear. Is there any aspect of government's approach to plastic and plastic waste that you can support?
So, absolutely. The consultations about the recycled content mandate that Environment Canada has initiated is a very broad, stakeholder-rich discussion. There are a lot of very serious questions about, we're going to talk about the phytosanitary issues associated with certain aspects of the recycled contents. Like you mentioned low-value products like benches. Those are high-value products to parents who sit in parks and watch their kids play. Like, if we are going to recycle things and we're going to collect those things, we need to deploy them back into the economy in a way that they're useful. And some food packaging, some medical devices, they have very specific requirements, and there are challenges associated with meeting those phytosanitary requirements. So in the meantime, let's make more benches. I have a chair in my backyard from the plastic waste from London, and it's a very comfortable chair. So don't be so quick to dismiss some of those other uses. Recycled content mandates will work. They will create the economies of scale that will be required to make the improvements needed to our recycling system. Like, I think all three of us agree that we are not doing a great job at this in Canada. Well, the more we can invest into that system to improve it, the better.
Great. And to you as well, the part of the Act that was used to designate plastics as toxic is the basis for Canada's Chemicals Management Plan. Are you able to explain to the committee the process by which a chemical substance is assessed and managed and the steps that the CMP undertakes to ensure that there is targeted risk management?
Absolutely. And I think with the exception of this particular regulation, Canada has the global gold standard when it comes to chemicals management. And that is because we have a multi-phased approach where we look at the volumes of the chemistries in question. We do a risk assessment on each individual chemistry and those uses. We identify uses where there might be some types of exposures of concern. Then we have very targeted rules on how we're going to do the risk management for those chemistries. It just feels like on this particular one, they're doing something different. But Canada is the world leader on chemicals management. We talked earlier about the advent of the Stockholm Convention. Like this rule, which was originally designed by Prime Minister Chrétien's government and implemented by Prime Minister Harper's government, is the beacon around the world for the efficient use of resources and ensuring that chemistries are being used in products in a way that are safe for Canadians.